Good.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are,
you might be.
Thank you so much for stopping in with me today. I appreciate it. I'm very excited
to
not have feedback. Let me go ahead and fix that here. This is my first time running a Zoom webinar all on my lonesome. So it's very fun and exciting time for me to try and make sure that I'm getting this right. But thank you all for joining me. It's 9 o'clock here in Denver, the Mile High City, where I'm broadcasting today. I know that we have people from all over the world really registered for this event. I'm really excited to be able to share with you all today. Now it's going to be just an absolutely wonderful time to bring everybody in, have some fun, learn a little bit about accessibility for UX design, accessibility and inclusion, topic very near and dear to my heart. We're going to give everybody just a couple of minutes here to join in the fun. We'll probably start things in about 4 minutes. And people who are passed over on the broadcast, excuse me. Let's see here. People who are still joining the broadcast will be able to join us and have some fun as well. I see about 46 of you. Yeah, it looks like you should be auto muted when you come in. So I don't believe I'll be able to hear anybody else on the broadcast. I think the only person that should be not auto muted is me. So again, the first time running a Zoom broadcast, Zoom webinar particularly. I've run a lot of Zoom meetings, never run a Zoom webinar before, but I am keeping an eye on the chat. We'll get started here in about 3 more minutes, but thank you all for joining me. I would love to hear where everybody's joining from. I did see, looks like Abedamad. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Pronunciation of names, despite being a journalist, was never really my biggest, easiest thing for me. But it looks like joining from India. Let me know where you're joining from in the chat. Love to see where everybody's coming from today. I am in Denver today. It is a beautiful, sunny, gorgeous day today. We are currently sitting right around about 70 degrees, which is perfect for this time of day. 73 degrees right now. Denver, Colorado. Hello, Lindley. We got Cleveland, Ohio, Northeast Ohio, Nigeria, absolutely. San Diego, California. Really wonderful. Nottingham, UK. Wow, absolutely. England, UK. I would suppose England is part of the United Kingdom. Great to see everybody here. Washington, Rio, Newbury, UK, Iowa. Wow. Okay. We got some Hamburg, Germany. Absolutely. Greetings from hot and humid New York City. Thank you, Heather. And great to see you, Heather. Absolutely. Boulder. Absolutely. Madrid. Good to be here. Southwest UK, Broomfield, Canada. Oh, Canada. Pune, India, Chicago, Mexicali, Mexico. Oh, I'm going to come visit Mexicali when I get a chance. Sunnyvale, Fort Myers. Hello from Croatia. Love Croatia. Hi, Stephanie, coming from Oakland, originally from France. Thank you for joining us today, Stephanie. Really appreciate it. Absolutely great to have you here. London, Minneapolis with Whitney. Absolutely. Really wonderful. A lot of my favorite places in the world joining me today, which makes me very happy. Everywhere from San Diego to Chicago, Minneapolis, London. Can't wait to get to back to some of these places that I've been to, and can't wait to visit some of these places that I've never been. Hopefully at some point in time, I'm hopeful they'll be able to get over to, assuming our COVID situation clears up, I'll be able to get over to London and somewhere in Africa next year. Got a lot of people that follow me out in those areas, particularly the UK. London seems like a pretty straightforward choice. But it is what it is, absolutely. And of course, for my very first broadcast, I'm breaking out in zits. So unfortunately, I don't have, in Serbia. Hello, Desco from Serbia. Unfortunately, I don't have a makeup team, so I can't really do much with that. All right, well, we see, looks like we've got a good 57, 58 folks, there are 59, so people are still straggling in, but we're gonna go ahead and get started here today. And let's get started with our talk. So let's go ahead, I am going to share my screen too. There we go, absolutely. All right. Let's get this set up. And of course, part of this is just dealing with. There we go. All right, great. Absolutely. Okay. So I will be keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A. So please, if you have anything, any questions, throw those in the Q&A, throw those in the chat. I'll be answering those as they're appropriate. And of course, if you're having any technical issues or that sort of thing, let me know in terms of not being able to see video, audio, or my screen share. At this point in time, though, you should be able to see screen one, which was the broadcast countdown. So just a little bit about me for anybody that's new to me, that joined me today, that hasn't really heard much about me, but is very kindly joining me. I have worked in UX for about the past 11 years. So that means I've previously worked with a company called CACI, which did software for the defense and intelligence industry here in the United States. Worked with E-Trade, which is a stock trading application here in the US, and also the Denver Broncos, which is one of the professional major American football teams. My hometown football team. It was a great honor to work for them. I am currently on day one of being a full-time UX freelancer and content creator. So very excited about that. And so this is, yeah, very much a dry run for me to figure out how to give you the best content. So of course, if you have any suggestions, any thoughts, I'd love to hear feedback. You can follow me and get in touch with me pretty much everywhere. LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, at Doug Collins UX. If there's a social media platform, you can find me there. You can also go to denveruxer.com. That is my personal website. And I put up all of my video content, including my morning moments, which talks about the 3 biggest things going on in the UX world today, at youtube.com/Doug Collins UX, and my afternoon answers, which is every morning on Twitter. I post a question, a UX-based question for us all to chat about. And in the afternoon, I give the 3 best answers along with my own takes. Broadcast I call Afternoon Answers. You can find that on YouTube or on Twitter as well too. If you really like what I'm doing today, really like what I'm doing here, want to support me, I try and make everything as free as possible because I want to make sure that everybody has as much access to this as possible, and that it's a very good, straightforward system to be able to give you some information that's useful, helpful, and going to make the world a better place. You can support me by visiting patreon.com/Doug Collins UX, leaving a donation. Every little bit helps. Even $1, whatever, it always helps. But if you can't afford anything, know that I'm just happy to have you here. I'm happy to be learning with you today, sharing some of my knowledge, and I'm sure I'll be learning some new things along the way. So let's dive right in. Let's start talking about UX design for inclusion and accessibility. So let's talk a little bit about the class to start over with everything here. I want to talk about what we're going to learn today. So the first thing we're going to talk about, and the first thing we're going to learn, is how to design with an eye for inclusion and accessibility. We'll also talk about those terms, inclusion and accessibility, here in a bit and what they mean. We're going to be learning about how to make our sites more usable for all, not just those with permanent disability concerns. One of the biggest misconceptions is that accessibility design only helps those with permanent disability concerns. We'll talk about how that's a fallacy and why accessibility and inclusive design affects us all. We're also going to talk about, I just want to talk about who should take this class. This is more for people that are watching this online later down the road, because we are going to share this on my YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and look at that, you certainly can. And for anybody that's watching this on the YouTube channel down the road, if you're wondering if this class is for you, this class is really for current UX pros wanting to learn new skills, new UXers looking to learn new best practices, anyone wanting to advance the conversation of accessibility and inclusion. So again, a couple other things about what you learn. We're going to talk about the different types of disabilities. We're going to talk about physical disabilities. We're going to talk about cognitive disabilities. We're going to talk about also U.S. practices for inclusive and accessible design. So what makes best practices? What makes UX best practices for an inclusive, accessible design? And why accessible design matters from an ethical and business perspective. We'll be hitting those points along the way as well. So I want to make a quick note here about what inclusive design is versus what accessible design is, or accessibility design. So inclusive design, you often hear both words used in similar ways in different conversations. And really, a lot of people try and sort of make these interchangeable. There is a technical difference. Technically speaking, accessibility design focuses on the end result. What is the end result of your design? Is it accessible for people with accessibility needs? Inclusive design is a methodology for how to approach the design. It's more of a way of thinking. In practical terms, this means that very often accessible design is more in conversations about changing a product that's already been put out, whereas inclusive design is thinking about accessibility and inclusive design for people with disabilities as we go about creating our designs through the entire design process from beginning to end. For our class, we're going to use the terms interchangeably. So you'll hear about me talking about accessibility design, inclusive design. Just know that for our purposes right now, they mean pretty much the same thing, and that is okay. Let me just make sure. I just want to make sure I've got question and answers open here as well, because I'm keeping an eye on the chat. I am keeping an eye on questions and answers. So please feel free to let me know if you're running into any issues whatsoever. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about our next piece here. So what does inclusion and why does, excuse me, inclusion and accessibility design matter? So UX design caters to the needs of all potential users, right? That is the base importance of UX design, is that we're trying to not leave anyone behind. We're trying to make everything as good as possible for all users. Currently, there are about 1.3 billion people worldwide that are permanently disabled. So this is people that suffer from some sort of vision, hearing, or cognitive or physical disability across the world that is permanent in nature. But when you start to think about how accessibility design can include different people and different folks, you begin to realize that accessibility design isn't really just for those 1.3 billion people. You begin to realize that we all suffer from accessibility needs throughout our day, right? So I have a 3-year-old son, and if I am trying to hold him in one arm and I am trying to use my phone to do something else, I have as many functional arms to use my phone as somebody that was born with only a single arm. If there's a construction worker working in a loud work zone that's trying to view video content, they're as functionally deaf to the audio portion of that video content as somebody who was born without hearing. So when you begin to look at sort of these micro disabilities, you begin to realize that we all have accessibility needs throughout our day. And from a business perspective, that makes accessibility and inclusive design extremely powerful, because we're not catering to what's thought of as a minority audience. Although at 1.3 billion people worldwide, it's one of the largest minority audiences that you could possibly have. But we're catering to everyone. We're catering to everyone's needs and just making our products better for all of our users. So let's talk quickly about types of disabilities. I want to talk a little bit about the different types of disabilities and some of the technologies that are used to help people manage those disabilities in terms of how they go about navigating the web and web content. So let's see here. Let's talk first about visual impairment. So we have a visual impairment. These are people that have some sort of vision or seeing issue. We also have folks that are deaf or hard of hearing. And we're also going to talk about intellectual and cognitive disabilities. Those that might be things like learning disabilities. They may be things like anxiety or social stress. And we also want to talk about other physical disabilities, people that maybe have a loss of limb or are paralyzed or require some physical assistance to use a particular device. Let's dive in and talk a little bit more about visual impairment here to keep things going along. So there are different types of visual impairments. There are people that are fully impaired. So these are people that are completely blind, what we think of as classically blind, who have no ability to see, no light perception at all. There are folks that are partially impaired. They might have some light perception, they might have blurred vision, and there are also folks that are colorblind, right? So these folks there are different types of colorblindness. I don't think a lot of people realize this. We tend to think of colorblindness as sort of that test that we all see when we're, kids in elementary school or done in grade school. We go to the doctor's office and they put, a circle with the big number 5 in it. And if you read it as a 7, then all of a sudden you're going to need, a special type of glasses and some help with accessibility throughout your life. But in truth, there are a wide variety of different color blindness out there. Everything from what they call red weak or red blind, green weak, green blind. There's blue weakness. There's also monochromacy, which is where everything is in grayscale. That's about less than 1%. I'm sorry, less than 0.1% of the population, but it is still out there in a group that we need to consider. So our folks with visual impairments use screen readers as one of the main ways of navigating a website. Screen readers are a piece of software that go onto a computer or a tablet or a phone that translate a site or app into spoken language or even a braille display. So this can actually be almost looks like a keyboard thing that braille will pop up and you can read with your fingers, which is a really interesting way of doing it. The way that screen readers work is that they evaluate the site's code and structure to see how a website is put together, and then we'll actually read that back. They also use the site structure to help with navigation. So screen readers may navigate by skipping from link to link on a particular page. Now they may navigate by going from header to header or even image to image. There are a lot of different ways that folks can use screen readers. It's also worth noting that the language for most screen readers is sped up considerably. So the pace that I'm speaking to you is about 120-ish words a minute if I'm speaking at an average pace. I'm a little nervous right now, so it might be about 150. Some folks who have been using screen readers for a long time will speed up the speed of the spoken text to them to the 300 to 500 word per minute speed. So it will sound a little bit interesting. I do want to share, and I want to share with you a demo of what a screen reader looks like. This demo comes from Mark Sutton, who is with the University of California, San Francisco IT department. We're going to dive in a little bit of the way already into the video, but I want to show you how screen readers work, give you an idea of sort of how they are put together. So let's go ahead and take a look at that here. Guys, I'm hearing that there's no audio for the video. I'm not sure why that's not coming through. So I'll try and give a or an idea of what he's doing here and kind of keep an ear out. But he's talking about how he's navigating through, and you can see he is actually navigating through line by line. And what's happening is that what you see down here in this bottom bottom part of the page is what's actually being read off to him by the screen reader. So you get this visual display of the audio portion that's coming out here too. And he's talking about the need to navigate quite along these different sites. So, so now he's going to show a few examples of how a screen reader can fall apart. So he's looking at this particular image. And what we're seeing out here is this image has what's called an alt description, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. But that currently is telling him what that image is about. And he's going to tab down and look at this next image here. And this next image doesn't have an alt description. So what we get, rather than getting an alt description for that image of what that image actually is a description of just the file name, reader0416. That doesn't really help anyone. This is also an example of how screen readers look at tables. So this is a well-described table that he has for us. He can see, okay, I'm looking at header of each column, and it tells me where I am within each column. So it's reading out approved 1975, column 2 of 3. And so it's kind of letting him know where within that table his screen reader is. So some of this is coding based, right? But these are things that we can keep in mind and things that we can test for when we're doing some of our usability testing as well. This is the table he's in now is kind of a table that's not very well formatted. So it's telling him, what's in each cell, but it's not telling him where he is within the confines of that table. So if you get lost with inside of that sort of table cell, it becomes really, really difficult to understand what exactly is happening and what's going on. So we'll go ahead. We'll skip that off there. Sorry for the no audio portion of that. Wasn't sure if that was going to work or not, but well worth kind of an idea. So what I'm going to do after this class is I'm going to throw up some links on my Twitter profile. You can visit me, Doug Collins UX on Twitter. And I'll throw up some links to these different YouTube videos, as well as the live stream for anybody that was unable to make it today, and should hopefully be able to help us out that way. But I also have a few other pieces that I want to share with you as well too. Absolutely. So let's go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about what we've got going on next, which is deaf or hard of hearing folks is kind of our next step. So just a reminder of what we consider deaf or hard of hearing. People with auditory impairments need ways to access audio portions of content, right? So this might be video content that they might have, or just straight up audio content, things like podcasts, certainly something that folks that are deaf or hard of hearing want to be able to participate in, but may not necessarily be able to. There are a few different ways that we can help out with folks who are deaf and hard of hearing. There is closed captioning. So we talk about closed captioning versus open captioning. What closed captioning is when you are in a particular video and you have the option to turn captions on and off about what's going on within that video. So closed captioning is not subject to loss of quality on video enlargement, unlike open captions. Excuse me. Open captions are content that has the written portion actually included in the video file. So rather than being able to turn it on or off, it's always there. It's hard coded into the video file. Closed captions are not subject to loss of quality on video enlargement, and you can view the text without having to view the audio. Closed captions are not supported by all web browsers, though. There are still a few web browsers and different platforms out there that don't support closed captioning. And it requires user knowledge of how to turn those on and off, right? If you've never run across closed captions before, that might be something that's different for you. I see a couple of questions in the Q&A here. One was no audio on the video. Curious to hear about any accessibility considerations you made for the presentation. Yeah, so I can talk about that, Allison, absolutely. So Allison asked about accessibility. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. All right. So designers text on. Okay, we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Absolutely. So let's continue on, talk a little bit about open captions. Got ahead of myself there. So open captions require no special knowledge or software to use. They're always there as part of the video. Universal benefits, even for those without disabilities. So open captions, one of the things that I always find myself using captions for more than anything else, I love our friends in the UK, but very often, especially for folks that are sort of not accustomed to hearing a UK accent. Sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish different accents in the United Kingdom. So I'll find myself using either closed or open captions just to sometimes understand some of the spoken words, especially if they're spoken very quickly in an accent that I don't understand. I've even used them for Southern accents before. Being from Colorado, I have a very sort of nondescript accent comparatively speaking to a lot of other places in the United States. Cons of video captions. You can see that the video quality is degraded if you have to view the video at a larger size than what it was created at. And some users can find the unedited captions distracting. Absolutely. So one of the reasons why I always had a hard time going to just movies that have just subtitles to them that aren't done in English and have that open caption in them is because I find it distracting to try and see what's going on the screen and actually try and read as well too. As I have a bit of ADD and a little bit of dyslexia, those have always been extremely hard for me. So just wanted to answer a quick question as we are at a good stopping point here for a second. Allison Jackson asked, curious to hear about any accessibility considerations you made for this presentation. Can you share more about that process? Yeah, so I'm actually using this presentation as a guinea pig for some of my accessibility pieces. One of the things I was trying to figure out was how I can do live captioning as I was going through this. Wasn't able to successfully get that done, but I was able to figure out a way where I can do some captioning post. So I'm going to make sure that we have a version of this video that has at least auto-generated captions available. And I'm actually going to hire someone to do a video transcript. I'm sorry, a transcript of this video, which we'll talk a little bit about what those look like here in a moment. We also ran through some of the other pieces in terms of content contrast. It was one of the big pieces that we looked at. And I wanted to make sure that I did as much as I could. There were a few other things that I went through that my mind is blanking on right now, but I did do more than a few accessibility checks. It's one of those things I want to get better on and actually be able to be much more of an authority. But as this is my first Zoom webinar, still a lot to learn for me. So definitely bear with me while I'm going through with this here. Let's see here. Just looking for a moment just to see if there's any other Q&As that we can answer. And so Jelena Hay has a question about our responsibility as UX designers to push accessibility as much as possible. Like previous questions, do we need to push developers? We'll talk about that as we go through here, Jelena. So definitely keep an ear open for that. All right, let's continue on for right now. And we'll get back to more Q&A. Charles, by the way, Charles Hall wrote an article on open captions. Charles, please let me know if you have a link to that, or you can post that in the chat, and would love to see that article here. So audio transcripts, again, one of the things I'm going to hire someone to do for this particular broadcast is audio transcripts are a written description of the conversation, actions, and content of a video. They end up looking very much like a screenplay, if you've ever been, or just a regular play, if you've ever been in the theater world, and something that can be very helpful out there. Let's talk about some intellectual disabilities, and let's talk about some of the considerations that we make for folks with intellectual disabilities. So there are some intellectual disabilities that are glaring, but there are some that are more subtle, right? Some people, have some more subtle issues. We also, one of the things we see a lot for intellectual disabilities is that we are lacking in technological aids for them. So a lot of intellectual disabilities, you might think of things like ADD, you might think of things like autism, you might think of things like generalized anxiety, you might think of things like depression, can also be considered an intellectual disability. These are all things that people suffer from, and they're not always visible. Sometimes they are, but very often intellectual disabilities are more subtle and harder to pick up on. As a result, I think because of how hidden some of these can be, we see that intellectual disabilities are often lacking in technical aids. That there's not a lot that's being done out there. There have been some folks that have tried to tackle, for instance, dyslexia by creating fonts that supposedly help with dyslexia, but the research shows that they actually don't do a whole lot. So even some of the technological aids that are out there really don't do a ton for the folks that are trying to access those. So we'll talk about how to manage some of the intellectual disability considerations with UX best practices, which is really the best way to make sure that we are going about managing some of the difficulties that our friends with intellectual needs might have. Let's also talk about physical disabilities here as well. So physical disabilities, we might think of somebody with limited motor function, right? So we might think of somebody that has a tremor. My father, struggled with tremors for pretty much his whole life, and it was certainly something that affected him and how he used technology and how he could even do basic things as far as write. So we need to make sure that we're paying attention to folks with limited motor function. We might also see folks with full motor function loss, folks with a paralysis, loss of limb, so either partial or full paralysis. These folks with physical disabilities use a few different assistive options to help them browse, either via a computer or via their phone. One of the things that we see very often with folks with limited motor skills, oh my goodness, I misspelled keyboard, keyboard. Keyboard browsing is a very big piece of assistive technology, often used by folks with limited or no motor function. We also see mouth sticks as an option that was very famously used by Christopher Reeve. We see eye tracking software as an option for folks trying to navigate, and also cheek movement tracking, which is what Stephen Stephen Hawking's computer used. So let's dive into our next part here. Next part, I want to talk about the WCAG or WCAG guidelines. So WCAG 2.1 is the version that we are. What is it? So let's talk about what these are and why they're important to know. The WCAG 2.1 was created by the World Wide Web Consortium, who we call the W3C. They're kind of one of the big players in setting web standards internationally. The WCAG are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We are currently on version 2.1. Recently, there was a few years ago, version 2.0 was released. Version 2.1 was recently released. If you've taken my class on Skillshare, a lot of this content may sound familiar to you, but it focused on 2.0. We are on 2.1, so there's some new content in here for our version 2.1. This class focuses mostly on the aspects of WCAG, WCAG 2.1 applicable to UX and UI design. So the actual standards applies for all sorts of things, and a lot of it has to do with coding or backend practices, but the pieces that can be affected or moved most consistently by UX design are what we have here. So I want to make sure that we understand that there is more to these. If you go to the World Wide Web Consortium's website and search for WCAG 2.1, you can read through the full list, and there's certainly much more good tips there. This class is meant to be an overview of the pieces that are most commonly affected by UX and UI design. All right, let me just take a quick moment here. Just make sure I'm not missing anything on the Q&A. Some of these I will come back and look at, but looks like, let's see here. All right. So let's talk about some of the guiding principles of the WCAG guidelines. So every website should be perceivable, right? Every website needs to be perceivable by everyone that's coming through to it, especially when we talk about folks with visual or auditory impairments. That's a very big piece to understand. Every website needs to be operable for everyone. So when we talk about operable, we need to make sure that everybody who's coming to our website needs to be able to use that website in a way that makes use of their assistive technologies if they're needed, but also allows them, if they have limited motor function, to be able to use all the content on those sites. Every website needs to be understandable. This is a big piece, particularly for when it comes out to intellectual disabilities. And every website needs to be robust. So it needs to work with a wide variety of assistive technologies. So let's talk a little bit about the core components of making your site perceivable, which apparently I forgot to add the fade here. So there are a few different pieces here. So for making our site perceivable, we need to make sure that we are providing alternatives for non-text content. We also need to make sure that color alone should never be used to convey information. We also want to set appropriate contrast ratios for content, not just text. And we're also not going to autoplay audio or video content and not restrict content to a single orientation. We'll talk more about each of these points in depth here momentarily. For making our site operable, again, we'll talk about each of these points individually as we go through here, but we want to make sure that our site works with assistive technologies, particularly keyboard browsing. Fixing a lot of issues that you run into with keyboard browsing will actually fix a lot of issues that you run into with other assistive technologies. We also want to avoid content that could trigger seizures, right? That's one that's very near and dear to my heart. My mother-in-law, who is actually very kindly upstairs helping look out after my two kids, has definite seizure issues. So we want to make sure that we talk about that here as well and how to avoid that, and relying on motion actuation. So like shaking a phone to trigger functionality. Making your site understandable, we're going to talk about avoiding unusual words, jargon, and abbreviations, why that's important. We're also going to talk about how to write site content to a 9th grade reading level. So folks with learning disabilities or other intellectual needs might be able to better understand our content. We're going to talk more about why forms should have labels, instructions, and good error handlings, and why it's important to provide help content. And then the last piece, under making your site robust. All user agents, which are variations of web browsers, should be able to access and use the content on that site. We're also going to focus particularly on this one, particularly for screen reading technologies. So if you can kind of nail those two, the screen reading technologies and the keyboard technologies, that takes care of a lot of the other assistive technology needs If those two are very sharp, usually the rest of your assistive technologies will be able to use sites well. Looks like I have that here again. All right. So let's dive more into the section about making your site perceivable. And let's see here, just answering some questions from chat here as we come through. Charles Hall did point out quickly that version 2.1 of WCAG shipped on June of 2018. 2.2 is expected in November of this year, and 3.0 is a work in progress, which will be interesting to see. Whitney asked, what are the WCAG similarities and differences between website and app design? WCAG is meant to apply both to website and app design. So we want to make sure that we're applying these as much as possible to all technologies that we use out there. What do you find that accessibility is on top of most companies' priority list pre-launch, or only once they have been sued or called out for not being accessible after launch? Depends on the company. Some companies are much better about that than others are. But it's certainly something that we talked about the difference between accessibility and inclusion, right? If your company has really an inclusive design focus, then you'll see that more throughout the design process. If your company is talking about accessibility, usually that means that they have a product that they understand needs accessibility enhancements. So they want to make sure that they're getting those done, but that might be the result of being sued or called out for not being accessible post-launch. Honestly, we'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons why this matters and some of the business impacts, but the best thing that you could do to help protect yourself from things like ADA lawsuits, and if you're in the European Union, some of the accessibility lawsuits you might see there, is to have an inclusive design focus, to actually have that be part of your design process. And we'll talk about some of the tools that we can use for that as well too. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about making your site perceivable. So again, this is the first tenet of the WCAG guidelines. When we talk about making our site perceivable, we're talking about making our site perceivable for all users, regardless of disabilities. We want to follow established design best practices. This is a great way for us to make sure that a lot of what our users will need is getting done. Honestly, a lot of what UX design is based upon are based upon some of the basic needs that folks have from accessibility standpoint, even if we may not think of them that way. So a lot of the pieces you might read here are certainly pieces that are important to have. Let's talk quickly about alternatives for non-text content. So images with alt attributes. So we want to make sure all of our images have alt attributes. This is something that we need to consider writing if we're a UX writer or a content writer. For a site are good descriptions of what a particular image is. So like when we saw in our screen reading demonstration before, when a screen reader or someone using assistive technology is trying to get a description of that image, they know what that might be. So an example of that is I have my UX News Mag website and the editor of uxnewsmagazine.com. And here in sort of the main center page is my ugly mug, which I thought would be a good idea to display here. What I've done is I've inspected this element, and we can see here in the code this alt piece where it says alt, and let me give a bigger version of that. So we actually see here alt description of this image says a headshot of Doug Collins, editor of uxnewsmag.com. That would be a good alt description for a particular image. We want to make sure whenever we're including images within our content that we're providing our developers with an alt description. It's not necessarily up to us unless we work in a job that's a UX engineer job. We're expected to do both the design and the coding to include this, but we do want to make sure that we're giving good solid descriptions and making sure that we're not leaving that up to our our development friends. So that'd be an example of a good alt text. So a bad description, bad alt text here might just be Doug Collins or a headshot or editor of UX News Magazine, because that requires additional knowledge that the user might not have about that particular image. You want to try and be as descriptive and succinct as possible. It's actually really good exercise in micro content writing. So if you're looking to get some practice with that, writing alt descriptions is a great way to get used to that. Some alt descriptions are very short. Sometimes they are a necessity longer. You'll see that a lot in news websites. That alt descriptions do tend to be significantly longer. Let's also talk about captioning. So closed or open captioning. Let's take a quick look at what captions may look like, just as kind of a reminder here. So this is an example of what a closed caption or an open caption might look like, where we've got our captioning down across the bottom of the screen here. We can see the words that are coming up as they're being spoken. In this case, it says doing it by hand. Well, more work will give you much better results in the end. I had to pick this image because I'm thinking of making some lasagna from scratch later this week. So that should be a lot of fun. But it's certainly something that we want to make sure that we're giving those opportunities out there to have that alt text. I'm sorry, to have that captioning going on here. I apologize. I am getting blasted. Um, Blasted with notifications for some reason. We want to make sure that we're having these captions available to us. So we've talked about captioning. Let's talk about audio transcripts real fast. Let's show an example of what an audio transcript might look like here. This is an example of an audio transcript. So really it's pretty laid back, and you can see some of these are usually very clean. Sometimes, so what we have here is we have Steve and Brad having a conversation. So we can say, Steve says, welcome back, Brad. The second part of our interview. I want to get through these as quickly as possible because I know you have somewhere to be. Brad, thank you. It's my pleasure. Steve, it says on your website that you work doing graphic design for a local branding agency, blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. It looks like a functional script from a play that's based off of what was said in a particular video. So this is kind of an example. This comes from opaltranscriptionservices.com. They are a company that I have no affiliation with, but they offer transcription services. A lot of places, if you have video content, will do the transcription for you. It's one of those tasks that can be very, very tedious. So if you're not used to doing it and don't have much practice doing it, then certainly something that you want to take a look at. Maybe having someone do those transcription services for you. But it can be very valuable. For folks that can't access audio portions of the content, can be great. It's also great for your own particular uses if you're trying to make a video library. So be able to have a searchable video library on your site. This is a great way to make sure that the content within those videos is also searchable as well. So last thing I want to bring up as a possible alternative for non-text content is sign language interpretation, right? We see this very often where nowadays it seems to be becoming more and more common, which is great. Well, we'll have sign language interpretation going on at the bottom of the screen. I don't know much sign language except for what I've taught my taught my daughter and son. I know milk, I know good night, thank you, you're welcome, I love you, all sorts of, you know, sort of phrases that you teach a young kid. But sign language, especially for folks that are using it more and more often, is becoming much more common to see sign language interpretation included, especially with live public broadcasts or concerts, that sort of thing. It's something that you can consider including in your broadcast as well, particularly if you have somebody on staff that speaks sign language well, or if you have a group that will be using your service that speaks sign language, that is important to them. All right. So let's see here. Continue on. I also want to talk about avoiding use of color to convey information, right? So that's one of the cardinal sins of UX design, I feel like, is using color alone to convey information. That was one of the first things I learned in design school. Never use color to convey color alone to convey information. So let's keep in mind, let's talk about people who are colorblind, right? 8% of men in the world are colorblind, and about 1% of women in the world are colorblind. And if we're rounding up and using some nice round numbers, that means about 10% of your site visitors will have some form of colorblindness that they're going to be battling. I want to see how this can impact us in the physical world, and we can kind of translate that over to the digital world. So this is an image of a bathroom, right? And over each stall in the bathroom is a light that shows whether it is available or free. So our green lights here show us that they are free, and our red lights show us here that those stalls, are in use. So when we start to look at, how some of these different pieces look, this is how folks with blue chrome monochromacy might see it, which is, that's a little bit more subtle, but it's still there. We red blind will actually see kind of a blue and yellow light coming through that, if you're not paying too much attention, might be a little bit harder to discriminate against. And this is how folks with monochromacy see things. They just see that the lights are on. They can't tell which light is showing which color. We can kind of take that and translate that over to how we see those pieces coming up in our website design. So most common offenders for us in our site and app design are required form fields, right? We see this very often with form fields that are just outlined in red that are required, or maybe have a red underline that are required. It doesn't take much effort to put down the word required or mark it with an asterisk, some way to let us know that that field is actually required. We also see this very commonly with links that are color only styling, right? So it's become very fashionable for some reason to remove um, a lot of the ability to see whether or not a link can be clicked for anything else other than color. So we see that color only styling is very common. It's very, very difficult sometimes for folks that have color blindness to be able to understand whether or not they can find a particular link on a page that is actually clickable. We also want to make sure that we're setting appropriate contrast ratios for our content, not just particularly text content, but also for the rest of our content as well. Contrast ratios, if you're not sure what that is, contrast ratio is the difference between two colors. So black and white has a high, what we call a high contrast ratio. Black and gray, or white and gray, maybe less contrast ratio. The highest contrast ratio you can have is actually black and yellow, which is interesting. The WCAG guidelines call for a 5:1 contrast ratio, but what does that really mean? If you go to webaim.org, they have a lot of really great accessibility tools there, but they also have one of the things that they have there is a contrast ratio checker, where you can check the contrast ratio between different colors to make sure that they meet that 5:1 requirement for the WCAG guidelines. We talk about this not just for text content, but for any content on the site. So if we have say images or graphs that we're using, we want to make sure that they have that 5:1 contrast ratio as well too, between the colors that are being used in those images and graphs, if they're important for information transmission purposes. Obviously, if you're taking just a picture of mountains or something like that, you can't guarantee that. But if we have, say, one of the things that I see very commonly are these maps of the United States, where each state is has a different set of colors to tell us whether what data category that's in. Unfortunately, when you start talk about color blindness, those colors can really run into each other, so that the different colors that are similar in shade but different color might actually look different. I'm sorry, might actually look the same. Before I go on, I just want to check very quickly my Q&A here. Just make sure I haven't missed anything. Let's see here. With increasing inline SVG uses, do you know if there is an existing mechanism for alt tag and such elements? Boris, I actually don't know if there is an alt tag for SVG elements. If somebody in the chat knows and can throw that in, that's great. If not, I'll do some research and see if I can get back and post that answer to my question on my Twitter account. Kirsten asked, what would your solution be for alt text of images uploaded by users? That is a great question. We can't police everything that users do, especially on large websites where there's a lot of user interaction. The best that we can do is give them an option to add alt text and explain sort of what alt text is, right? So that this is a description of that. I see Kyle Knight, by the way, threw in there alt and an SVG. Looks like he threw in a link to csstricks.com. That's great. Absolutely. Thank you, Kyle, for throwing that in there. Let's see here. Make sure I haven't missed anything else. So it looks like we've answered all those questions so far. So we'll keep cruising along here. After I've had my sip of increasingly cold coffee. So Charles and Boris and Kyle are continuing conversation, by the way, in the chat about alt SVG. So if you're interested in that, you may want to check that out. Let's talk about avoiding autoplaying for video and audio content. This can be distracting for users, especially users with cognitive disabilities. Those folks, particularly with ADD, can find autoplaying videos and audio content particularly distracting. For a long time, many UX organizations have recommended that users have control over playing audio and video on a site. The Nielsen Norman Group, nngroup.com, has been advocating for this for years, and I could not agree more. We want to make sure that we're, as much as possible, we're giving users the ability to say, I want to see this audio, I want to see this video in my own time, and not have it be something that's displayed out there. This is one of those pieces where the business requirements and the business needs are to have as many views of a video as possible, right? Particularly for, we see this a lot in news organizations, CNN, NBC, whatever you might have out there as far as news organizations will try and autoplay video content as soon as you come into an article on that site. The reason being for that is that they get paid by their sponsors, their advertisers per view of that video. So if we have more views of that video, that we're forcing people to watch that video every single time they come onto the site, that means more advertising content. So this makes it very difficult sometimes to argue against autoplaying video. My best recommendation there is to show the UX design recommendation best practices from folks like Nielsen Norman Group, from folks like the Interaction Design Foundation, and hopefully folks like myself can weigh in on that as well too, and recommend against it, and we can find a way to help win that argument against some of the business practices. But that is one of the more difficult pieces to argue, particularly with organizations that are reliant on advertising dollars for those pieces. I see in some of the comments here that the autoplaying is very annoying. Microsoft still does it, and then Netflix autoplay currently. Yeah, Netflix is one of those particularly annoying pieces where essentially if you hover over a show for a second, it will autoplay whatever the trailer or the beginning of the next episode for that show might be. It's a way to try and hook you in, right? And Netflix is using that as a hook, right? They're saying, oh, you think you might be interested in this? Well, let me show you a little bit and we'll see if you actually are interested in that. Which, I understand where the idea is coming from, but it's not really a great implementation of that idea. And yeah, it really is, Sean, the absolute worst. I could not agree more. Thank you, Mackenzie, for bringing that example. Absolutely. I also want to talk about not restricting content to a single orientation, right? This is something that's very particularly important for mobile design. Obviously, a lot of people are, turning their computer monitors around, but you might find that you're using your phone either in landscape or portrait mode, depending upon what you're doing and what ability you have to do that. So some users actually have their devices mounted to other assistive technologies like wheelchairs. There are some wheelchair users that have an iPad mounted to their wheelchair, and that is the only way that iPad is ever going to be is in landscape orientation. That is to help with some of their assistive technology needs. And that means that they inherently have no ability to change that. It's locked into place. Even if they had the physical ability to do it, it's not going to change. There are also some users that just lack the physical capability to switch a device orientation, right? Folks that maybe don't have, don't have arms or have a loss of limb or have a loss of motor function might not be able to actually turn their device. We want to make sure that we're not restricting content to a single orientation, that it looks, functions, and is perceivable equally in either portrait or landscape mode. All right, let's dive into the next part, making your site operable. And I see Cecilia chiming in there with a comment about all social apps autoplaying videos too. Instagram has automatic alternative text generation for almost every photo through machine learning. That's actually pretty cool. I didn't know that. It's not the best, but it's getting there. Yeah, AI it's coming up. We'll get there. All right, let's talk a bit about making our site operable here. So when we talk about making our site operable, this is all about making sure that our sites work with a full range of assistive technology. We're going to look primarily at keyboard navigation for this piece for a few different reasons. When we talk about keyboard navigation, that means our ability, we want to keep in mind, that our ability to use a mouse depends greatly on fine motor skills. That's one of the first things that degrades when we look at folks with certain diseases that cause physical impairment, or even folks that are in an aging population that are getting a little bit older. Those fine motor skills tend to be one of the first things to go. The ability to use a keyboard, which is less fine motor skill, sticks around significantly longer than the ability to use a mouse. Keyboard functionality is a rather easy to test piece. If you have a keyboard and you have the technology that you're trying to test on, you can test this piece. Resolving issues for keyboard navigation resolves many other issues with other assistive technologies, right? If we are putting in some of our best practices for keyboard navigation, that means that a lot of the other pieces out there like screen reading and that sort of thing will be taken care of as well too. So some common issues that we see with keyboard navigation. And again, I want you to sort of think back, and I apologize that there wasn't the audio content for that video because it really was a good video. But think back to that example of a screen reader and how he was using his keyboard to navigate his screen reader through that site. Remember that folks that navigate via screen readers or via keyboards will navigate through a couple of different ways, right? So one of the ways they might navigate through a site is going through different navigational links, right? Sometimes it can be difficult to use your keyboard to get to links and get links in an expected order, right? So when we see links on a page, we tend to read top to bottom, left to right. A lot of times it's difficult and unintuitive for us to try and get to a particular link because we haven't set the appropriate order for that. We can also see that sometimes getting into and out of search form fields can be really difficult for whatever reason, depending upon the way search form fields are set up. Sometimes it can be very difficult to get into those. Also, navigating through forms in general can be difficult. Excuse me. So when we talk about navigating through forms, again, this is our top to bottom, left to right piece. So when we're talking about, okay, I expect to go my cursor to navigate through the form, starting at the top left corner and kind of navigating through those steps as we go down the page, as our eye would commonly flow across it. This is one of those pieces that is easy to test if you with some accessibility, usability testing to see whether or not it makes sense for your potential users. Also, we want to talk about what are called cursor traps. So when we talk about cursor traps, there might be different sections of the page that come up that you would want to navigate through. So you might have a modal that pops up and you want to navigate through options on the modal. You need to make sure that when you're navigating through options in that modal, that you don't accidentally get back onto content on the page, that you're only retaining the focus and retaining the navigational options on just what's in that modal. And let's see here. So we also want to make sure that we accomplish everything with the mouse, everything that we can accomplish with the mouse without a mouse. Let's take a quick example, by the way, of that modal navigation here. I'm going to play this. This video didn't have audio with it to begin with anyways. So we're going to look at it and just know that there's no audio. Always kind of an example here of what we're looking at. So this is somebody that's navigating via keyboard. You can see that they're going down, they're navigating through kind of top to bottom, left to right, navigating through buttons. And here pops up a modal. So they're navigating through, they're saying, okay, I want to see my full name, my email address, sign me up already. We're not getting back onto that content on that page, right? We're just nearly going through that modal. Now we're in our navigation piece. We're properly navigating through each of our navigation pieces without getting back to the page content. This is all about setting appropriate cursor traps so that we're not able to get back to that screen content without either closing out a modal or screen navigation and making sure that we're not sort of leaking out to a spot that we're not supposed to be. All right. So I want to talk very quickly about avoiding seizures. So avoiding seizures is all about avoiding flashing or blinking content, right? Flashing or blinking content can definitely set off seizures for some users, and flashing or blinking content is just bad UX for everyone. It's not been good. I don't know how many people were into web development back in the early to mid 90s, but there actually used to be a blink element in HTML that was quite thankfully deprecated. I forget when. I want to say it was late 90s, but it used to just blink whatever content was in that whatever content was in that tag. It was annoying as all goodness. It's annoying for all users. Just don't do it, right? Don't flash content. There's no reason to do it. We can create user interfaces that don't do that. Let's see here. So moving right along, don't rely on motion actuation. So this is, again, when we talk about motion actuation, we're talking about shaking our phone trigger some content, right? That could be an example of motion actuation, or moving a phone or moving a device to try and get it to do something. So flicking or throwing or whatever it might be. We want to avoid motion actuation as much as possible. So an example was Facebook's shake to report button. We have an example here of this kind of what motion actuation looks like. This isn't actually Facebook. This is a different site, but uses kind of the same thing. This is bug reporting via a shake. So we can kind of see what that looks like. And again, the audio on this, I'm not sure if it'll play or not. but audio not as important for this. So we can see he's actually shaking. We see, okay, shake detected. Let's click, I'm going to send a bug issue, unable to connect online. It's going to type us out there. So again, he shook the phone and that brought up that bug. So you can see somebody that actually has the ability to shake their phone, that's great. But one thing, if we think about this, I want to kind of pause this here as we go through and start this video. Okay, there we go. And I apologize, my PowerPoint is having issues. So we might skip back that. One thing I wanted to point out with that is that in this particular example, there was no alternative way to report a bug. That the only way to do it was by shaking the phone. Well, I'm waiting patiently for my PowerPoint to catch up with us. That's something that we want to make sure that we're not relying upon, right? Is having to shake our phone to trigger that. The way, our best practice, our way to way around that is to make sure that there's some sort of alternative method of providing that functionality, right? So a button or a link that we can click on that's going to allow us to perform those same functions. I don't think it would be a kickoff broadcast if I didn't have some sort of really wonderful technical issue. There we go. All right. Well, it looks like we may have made it past this. So one reason why we want to avoid relying on motion actuation is because those with tremors or operating with the system functionality could find this difficult, right? So if you have a tremor, right, you might always be shaking. I know my dad, whenever he held his phone, he always had a little bit of a shake. So he could be constantly reporting a bug on Facebook. So we want to make sure that we have an option to turn off any of those features for any of those folks that might have tremors or similar issues. Also, folks operating with assistive technology, particularly those folks that have physical disabilities where they're not physically interacting, they're relying on cheek reading or eye tracking, keyboard navigation, whatever you might have to go through with this particular piece. The ability to do this is not something that they're going to have. So we want to make sure that there's an alternative option there for them. Again, provide an alternative method for triggering functionality or the ability to turn it off completely. All right, so I want to pause, take another quick look at the chat here and take another quick look at the Q&A. Just make sure I haven't been missing anything. What would your solution? So Kirsten asked, what would your solution be for alt text? Oh, I'm sorry, we already answered that. Looks like we're good on questions and answers. And let's just take a quick look at the chat here. All right. And let's see here, more chat. There we go. All right. And it looks like we are caught up on chat as well. Okay, great. So let's continue on into, I'm sorry, making your site understandable, the next section of our talk today. So let's talk about making your site understandable. Let's go and talk about really what the core concepts are here. So make your site understandable is making sure that content can be accessible to all. We want to pay particular attention to those folks with cognitive disabilities. Those are one of the big people that are really affected by this make your site understandable pieces. It'll be one of the big focuses as we talk about accessibility from this standpoint. So avoiding confusing language is a big piece, particularly for those folks that suffer from autism or those folks that may suffer from ADD. And we want to make sure that we're avoiding unusual words, jargon, abbreviation, or acronyms, right? That can be very, very difficult to do, especially if it's a piece that you're very closely tied to. Sometimes we don't realize that words are unusual or that they're a jargon or jargon, which is, sort of industry standard speak that outside industry folks might not appreciate or understand. We might even just breeze over abbreviations or acronyms without even really thinking about, okay, I know what these means, or it seems obvious to me, but it may not seem obvious to somebody else that's using our particular product. When it's impossible to avoid these unusual words, these jargons, these abbreviations, we always want to make sure that we give some way to define each one of them, right? So this could be something as simple as if you hover over those words, they give you, the definition or the full spelled out words included in the abbreviation or acronyms. So certainly something that we want to make sure that we're doing there. Also, writing to a ninth grade reading level. This could be something that is difficult, but is one of the best ways to make content accessible for all users. When we talk about a ninth grade reading level, we're talking about ninth grade United States. So these folks are usually about 13, 14 years old. Sometimes it can be hard for us to judge what a ninth grade reading level might be. There are tools available that help you guesstimate what a ninth grade reading level might be. One of my favorites is HemingwayApp.com. Again, not affiliated with them at all, but I use them quite a bit to help me simplify my writing. But in general, a ninth grade reading level is going to have 2 to 3 sentences per paragraph and a shorter sentence length, 10 to 20 words at most. Most sentences are also going to be non-complex. So you're going to avoid joiners, ands, buts, etc. And Grammarly, by the way, Doug McDonald. Thank you, Doug, for chiming in with that. Grammarly is an awesome tool for simplifying text. Haven't used Grammarly a lot, but when I have, I've really enjoyed it. But yeah, definitely want to make sure that you do that. It's one of those great ways to make sure content's accessible to all, particularly those folks with learning disabilities or other cognitive disabilities. Let's talk about some forms best practices here as well, because this is also included in this piece. So we want to make sure that our page focus for our form is always visible. So we always know which form field we're in. And again, we're not relying on color alone to convey that information of where our focus is on that form, right? So as we go through and we change from form field to form field, we want to have some sort of visual representation that is non-color reliant that shows us where our focus is on that form. We also want to clearly identify input errors and suggest fixes, right? So one of the most annoying things that I see where this is common is when you try and sign into a website and it says either your username or your password was invalid. And you need to go back through and try again. You don't know whether it was your username or your password. You don't know what a potential issue might be. It just tells you your username or password is invalid. For some high security sites, I suppose that might be understandable, but for the vast majority of sites out there, really the best practice would be to say, that username is invalid or that password is invalid, or we don't have a user with that username. Again, there are some security concerns to be had there. So it's definitely one of those pieces you'll have to talk about with your backend development team and kind of come to a nice compromise. But it's sort of an example of where we might have input errors and suggest fixes in a way that's common, in a way that we can help make things much better for our users. We also want to make sure that we're labeling form elements and giving instructions, right? So having clear and concise labels is a big piece for success. We also want to make sure that we are giving instructions on how to fill out those pieces. So making sure that we can say, okay, if you're trying to fill out information about a short bio, right? So we might want to say short biography and just have a quick little piece of text that says, less than 150 words that describes you and what you do in your life. Just a quick, explanation of this. So James Reed had a comment about my login example. He said that's not the case. General security practice say not to say if it's username or password, just to say the login info is wrong. Else a hacker can try out usernames and see that they do exist. It just says password is wrong. This isn't just high security sites, it's for any login. James, I get where you're coming from there. And this is one of the examples that I wanted to highlight, because that's the common response from a backend piece is that, yeah, okay, if you tell them that one of the pieces is wrong, it makes it significantly easier to hack into. It's a balance. It really honestly is between security and usability in this particular case. And different sites are going to have different tolerances for it. So James, I appreciate the comment. I'm not saying that I disagree with you necessarily. Just kind of an example of one of the common areas where we see that. And I think there's definitely a usability argument to have there, particularly as AI and some of the next generation hacking tools come into play. We're actually going to experience very much a security crisis as it becomes significantly easier to hack into these sites. We're going to have to reevaluate the way that we do logins in general very soon, within the next couple of years, because things are progressing rapidly down that route. All right. So providing help content, I just want to make sure that we touch on that. So providing help content, again, another one of those pieces that's very important, particularly for, with folks with cognitive disabilities. We always want to make sure we have an option to get help, right? Whether this is a full-fledged help system or a modal that just gives us some additional information about whatever we're trying to accomplish, we want to make sure that there's always an option to give help. Again, that's another piece that's important for many folks with cognitive needs. All right. So let's move on to our last tenet here, making our site robust. So when we talk about making our site robust, we tend to think of robust as strong, right? When we talk about common language, robust usually means some sort of strength behind it, right? For us, this means that ensuring our site is going to work with all user agents, all different types of web browsers out there. That includes screen readers, which is kind of our big focus for this one. Some screen reader basics here. So we can harken back to that video that we saw, but screen readers are specific about how they present information to a user. Information from pages are generally presented in a very linear fashion. And some pieces need to make sense when they're read out of context. So for instance, we might talk about how links are a common way of navigating through a page, right? We saw that we were able to use a screen reader, or in some cases even keyboard technology, to navigate link to link to link. When we do that, we need to understand that our links need to make sense when read out of context. So we see that a lot. Uh, that links don't have a descriptive piece in terms of the content and their destination. Very often we see click here, right? Which is not good, right? So if you're navigating through a site and you have lots of click here's, right? If you want to read about the Denver Broncos 2018 schedule, click here. If you want to go and visit the Denver Broncos team store, click here. That doesn't help anyone that's trying to use assistive technology to get there, because all that they're going to get when they're navigating through the site is just a string of click here's. That's not going to help them figure out where there is. Now, what you could say is you could have your link be the Denver Broncos 2018 season schedule, or the Denver Broncos web store. If you have that as your text for your link, certainly is a lot easier for folks using assistive technology to figure out, again, both the description of the content and the destination, where it's going to take them through. So when you're writing those pieces, that's another great piece of micro UX copywriting that you can get some very good practice on, is writing those links in terms of descriptive of content and destination. All right. We also want to make sure that we're using elements for intended purposes. So buttons and links are kind of our two main offenders here. Buttons should always be used to complete actions, and links should always be used to navigate content. We have a tendency in web and app design to try and, for some reason that has honestly never fully been clear to me, sort of meld these two together. For some reason, we say it's okay for buttons to be used to navigate content, or links being used to complete actions. Buttons and links were created for specific purposes, and assistive technologies understand what those purposes are, and they're going to treat buttons and links differently. So you want to make sure that you are using buttons and links appropriately. So the buttons are only ever used to complete actions, and links are only ever used to navigate content. Otherwise, you might have run into issues where folks are navigating through content and accidentally clicking a button and performing a navigational piece, mistakenly thinking that it completes an action, or navigating through and clicking a link, thinking that it would complete an action, but it doesn't. It actually takes you to somewhere else on a page. All right, so that's what we have for today. I know we kind of cruised through things here a little bit faster than what I expected. Again, part of that's just nerves here. My very first webinar. Thank you all for being here for that. Some closing thoughts I wanted to share with you here today. So remember that accessibility isn't just for those with permanent needs, right? When we talk about these pieces, we do talk a lot about assistive technology, but we're also talking about a lot of just sort of best practices things that affect us all, particularly the pieces about audio content, pieces that are important to those with intellectual disabilities. A lot of those go a long way, and even physical disabilities. A lot of those go a long way towards making the World Wide Web and all of our apps significantly better for everyone that's going to be using them. Good accessibility is just good UX design when it comes down to it. You can't really say that you're doing good UX design unless you are included, accessibility pieces with those. We also want to make sure that we understand that we're using accessibility and inclusive design to guard against compliance issues, which is what we call the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, here in the United States. There's an increasing number of lawsuits, both in the United States and Europe, and I don't know about the rest of the world, but particularly on the United States and Europe, which are developing much more robust accessibility laws in terms of app and website design. We're seeing a much larger number of lawsuits coming through. By following the WCAG guidelines and making your site as accessible as possible, you're helping to protect yourself and your company from any lawsuits that might come through from ADA or GDPR repercussions in the European Union. And, lastly, we have a moral obligation as UX professionals to make the world an easier and more intuitive place for all, right? That's why a lot of us got into this, right? Is we want to help people. That's when it comes back to me, when people ask me why I do what I do, why I get into UX, and why I'm now doing, content creation, and why I'm now teaching UX, it all comes back to, I want to make the world an easier and more intuitive place for as many people as I possibly can. I think that's why a lot of us got into this industry, and I think that's why a lot of us stay in it. I certainly keep that as my guiding principle, and really good, solid, accessible, and inclusive design really hits this moral obligation piece very, very hard. So that is it. That is all that I have for today. I really want to thank everyone for watching. Again, it's been great talking with everyone. Thank you so much. I'm just looking through the Q&A here. Yeah, so a lot of people are saying I was or a few people were saying that they would like to have a copy of this recording. This will be up on my YouTube channel. It's actually live streaming now on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/DougCollinsUX. So you can certainly find it there. That will be available with captioning, auto-generated captioning. So if you want to go back and visit that, refer to this talk in the future. I'm also going to go over to Twitter here in a few moments and post up some links to the videos that we talked about today. Another piece that I'm going to post through on my Twitter account, which again is at DougCollinsUX on Twitter, is a link to a checklist that you can use to help us help make sure that your site hits all these different pieces that we talked about today. So I want to make sure that everybody has a session for that. But that's it. That's all that I have for today. Thank you so much for watching. I see all the things coming through. It really touches my heart to have so many people here with me today. It was great having everyone. Know that you all are the reason why I do this. That my love for the community and the people around me are certainly what drives me to do this. So again, any support you can give me, whether it's just following me, whether it's liking, subscribing, or going to patreon.com/DougCollinsUX, leaving a donation, whatever you feel, whatever is, driving you to help out, I would appreciate it. Also, I'm looking for some volunteers to help me out with these webinars in the future. So I'm not trying to manage chat and Q&As while I'm trying to talk here too. So if you're interested in helping out with that, please drop me a line. You can go to any of my social media accounts, or you can send me an email to doug@denveruxer.com. Thank you so much for watching. That's all that I have. Whoever you are, wherever you might be, thank you so much. Have yourself a great day and an excellent user experience.